Test 1, 2. Hello, 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 hello. You can kick me down by about 50%. Perfect. Yeah, there we go. That's way better. Okay. Is that better out there? Cool. Sue! All right, y'all ready to jump into this? Yeah? All right. So one of the things I love about coming here to the net, if you guys haven't figured this out, Glenn's my father-in-law. I'm married to his daughter, Emily. So one of the things I love with the net is I try to write a book every year, and Pastor Glenn always invites me here at the start of the year, and so I get to test out what I've been thinking through on you guys. Now, usually when I come, I've got my stuff a little bit more together than today. So I'm going to depend on a lot of feedback today. So if you guys hear something and you're like, that's an interesting concept, I want to hear, explain that a little bit better, let me know, because I'm working this out in preparation for writing the book. I've got the book about 50% written. So I might stop and go, I need to write something down. If I do, it's just me figuring it out for the first time. All right. So that's I have a master's degree in counseling, and I've really decided that one of the reasons that freedom of speech is so important is because we've found in counseling that most people don't know what they're actually thinking until they say it out loud. Have you ever noticed that? You actually say it out loud and you go, oh, that's what I'm thinking. And so a lot of times you don't realize what you're really feeling or thinking until you say it out loud. And when you do say it out loud, you're like, oh, okay. And that's one of the reasons that shutting down freedom of speech is so dangerous, just from a counseling standpoint, psychology standpoint, because if you don't allow people to voice their thoughts and ideas openly in a non-judgmental area, like in a non-judgmental space, then, because they're afraid of well, you can't say that, saying something that might offend, saying something that might be wrong, then you have people that literally can't think for themselves, because you actually can't think until you voice out loud what you're thinking. Does that make sense? Deep thought. But anyway, so I'm going to be sharing stuff today, and I may go, oh, wow, that was actually really good, and I might write it down, okay? So if I do that, that's what's happening. So I've got this concept that I'm working on is I have been working with so many people recently. I have a master's degree in counseling, like I said, and I've been working with so many people recently in counseling and as a teaching pastor that a lot of their issues as parents come from the model they got from their parents. And then it goes even further than that. A lot of them, their issue comes from with their parents, actually gets reflected on God. So I'll give you an example of this. I love my dad. He and I are like best friends, right? But my dad has this thing about him that he's super passive, super passive. He just lets things slide. And he's like, it'll work out. And I'm like, no, it's not going to work out. There's a train coming. It'll work out. And sometimes he gets hit by the train, and I'm like, I told you that train was coming. And he's like, how'd you see that train coming? I'm like, it was honking at us. But my dad's really passive in that way. And so sometimes he misses those things. I'm not passive. I'm a paranoid freak, okay? So I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I hear a train somewhere. So I'm like, everybody clear the room. But one of the things about my dad that frustrates me is that passivity. And I realized while I was writing some of this a couple months ago, I realized, that's one of my biggest fears about God. Is that God, I know he loves me. I know he's there to listen to me. I know he wants to hear me. He listens to my prayer. But I'm always concerned that he's never going to bail me out if I get in really big trouble. Because my dad would do that sometimes. He'd be like, it'll work out for you. And I'm like, I'm drowning here. And he'd be like, no. I remember we're trying to get into college. And again, I would say all this with my dad in front of me. So this isn't any new disclosure of information. But I remember when I was trying to get into college, and Dad was like, he didn't help me with anything. He's like, you'll figure it out. It'll be good for you to work your way through the process. I'm like, I don't know how this works. He'd be like, figure it out. That's a big fear I have of God. I'm like, God's never going to bail me out if I get in big trouble. So I got to make sure I don't get in big trouble. He'll help me with the little things, but if I get in big trouble, he won't bail me out. Now, is that actually true of my dad? No, Dad would bail me out. But a lot of times we project our image of this is what we're talking about today, our image of our earthly father, what he imprinted on us, or sometimes it's our mother, onto our heavenly Father. So that's what this whole idea is about, because I know a lot of us, we say, man, I want to take my family further than where our family went. So some of us, we grew up maybe poor, you could never get the Air Jordans growing up, and now you're like, I'm going to make sure my kids never lack for anything. Another thing of my dad, in his passivity, I'll never forget this. He was so cheap on stuff. So we were driving from Guatemala through Mexico to the United States. And this was like 20 years ago. Actually, let's be honest. This was 30 years ago. This was like 30 years ago. So it wasn't as easy of a drive it is now. But I remember in Guatemala, I was like, man, our tires are in really bad shape. He's like, I think we can make it through Mexico on those tires. I'm like, Dad. He's like, well, we'll just, it'll be cheaper to get them in the U.S. And I was like, sure enough, in the middle of nowhere in Mexico, our tires blow out. And we're stuck on the side of the road in Mexico. I'm like 12 years old, and I'm freaking out. And Dad's like, it'll work out. And sure enough, it did work out. But I remember swearing to myself as a 12-year-old, I will never, ever. When I told Emily about this, she was like, that's why you're such a freak about tires. I'm like, yes. I will never drive on bad tires. So I'm like, I change our tires when they're halfway down. She's like, what is your deal with tires? I'm like, I'm obsessed with getting the tires. But it's because of that. And some of us, we've all got these weird idiosyncrasies because of something our dad did. We're like, I'm never going to do that, right? And you love your parents, you love your mom, you love your dad, but she's like, yeah, we ain't going to do that when I get my own house. And you've probably said that about your own kids too. Yeah, I'm never going to my dad, he let me drive in Guatemala City when I was 15. My little, the permit they give you in the U.S., he stuck a picture of me on it so it looked more official, laminated it, and then let me drive in Guatemala. So when I showed it to police, I'm driving around with a permit. They don't know. It's in English, right? It's a driver's permit, and I'm driving around in Guatemala, and I look back, I'm like, Dad, what were you thinking? It'll all work out. That's my dad. He gave you a counterfeit driver's license? It wasn't counterfeit. It was, well, let me tell you how you get a real license in Guatemala. Let me tell you about the process of getting a license in Guatemala. You hire a lawyer, and you go to, this was back in the day. It may have changed now. Hopefully it's changed now. You go to a lawyer, and they say, okay, we can get you the driver's license. And they're like, what grade do you want on the test? Like, what do you mean? Well, if you want an 80, it's this amount. If you want a 90, it's this amount. I'm like, what if I want 100? Oh, well, that's this amount. But nobody gets 100 on the driver's test. So I'm like, okay. So you sign a thing that says I want something in the 80s, and a couple days later, a license shows up with your name on it. So it wasn't fraudulent. It was just a different way they do things down there. Anyway, this is my dad, right? So I love my dad. This is the way I grew up with my dad, a passive guy, and I became probably a little bit over-aggressive because of my dad's passivity. And that's what we do sometimes. We swing from one extreme to the other. And so we saw our parents did it. They raised their kids a certain way, and you're like, I'm never going to do that with my kids. And then you get over here. But this is what's really, really tricky is, as you start to have kids or you get married, you're like, my marriage will never be like this. And then you get married and you find yourself going, oh, I'm turning into my dad, or I'm turning into my mom. Maybe some of you are too young to realize that, but you're eventually going to turn into your dad or your mom. It's just the way it is. So that's what this whole concept is about, because I just see so many people that they say, man, I know I'm limited because of a bad model I got. Now, some of us, we had, let me just dive into it, right? So Blaise Pascal, he said this. You can go and switch over. Am I working? Blaise Pascal, you can click to the next slide. He says there's a God-shaped vacuum in all of us. Can we switch this PowerPoint? It'll all work out. See how aggressive I am? There it is. There's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man or woman, which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by God the Creator, made known through Jesus Christ. This idea that we are all made for the love of a father. And as we're growing up, there's nobody can replace the love of a father. But a lot of us, when you were growing up, we all have these three basic needs. And if you've ever heard me talk for more than about 10 minutes, you've heard me talk about this triangle, because I'm obsessed with this triangle. I've written books about it. But we all have three basic needs. These are our hopes, all of your hopes and dreams, everything you want for your future, the reason you're going to college, the reason you got married, the reason you're putting away money for retirement, all comes down to these three things. We all want a sense of security. We want to know we're going to be safe. We all want a sense of feeling that we're protected. And what happens is that because God offered us all three of these things, you'll see in a second, but a lot of times you didn't get that from the earthly representation of God, the first well, that's my next point, right? Is this: we get our first ideas about who God is from the first godlike figures in our lives, and so we're looking. God is the only one that can provide all these things for us: the security, the connection, the control. But we're looking for those things, and when we don't see it in the people that raised us, the first godlike figures, maybe you were raised by your grandparents, or maybe you were raised by an aunt and uncle, or whatever it was, we immediately begin to feel a lack because we're not going to get these from any human being. So we all need security. We need a sense of connection, which is feeling valued, esteemed, recognized that you're here, you're on earth, you're important, you've got some value, right? And then we all need a sense of empowerment. I use the word control. The better word is probably empowerment, but people don't know. Empowerment has gotten misappropriated, so I avoid the word empowerment. But it's a sense of having some autonomy and some say over our lives. And so everything you're looking for in your future is wrapped up in these things. And we're looking for these things from the time you're born. You're looking for these things because we were made to get those from God. Now, when sin entered the world, we were separated from the perfect source of that love, right? So we start looking for security, connection, and control from anywhere that we can get it. And the first natural thing, the first natural image we get of God's love is from those first godlike figures in our life. Now, if you grew up without a father, there's a very good chance you grew up without a sense of security. I've talked to so many people that their father abandoned the family, and that sense of security is a drive for them. So I was talking to a girl the other day, and she's just bounced from one relationship to another, to another, to another. And I noticed a pattern in all the guys she dates. They're these huge, ginormous men. And I was like, have you noticed that? And she's like, oh, I haven't noticed that. I was like, you must. And she's like, and when we unpacked it, Emily and I were sitting there in our living room, and when we unpacked it, she said, my dad basically abandoned our family. And she's like, I've always been looking for somebody to protect me. I just never felt protected. I was like, well, that makes sense for getting a huge guy too. But she would bounce from one relationship to another. As soon as one guy, that relationship would fall apart, she'd literally a week later be dating somebody else. And it's that God-shaped vacuum. She was looking for some sort of security, and she was trying to find it from a man in her life. Same thing with people in the connection corner. Maybe the fear for people for connection is a fear of rejection. So maybe you felt like you weren't enough to the first godlike figures in your life. You're like, man, I wasn't enough. Or maybe you had a dad that basically said that. Why can't you be more like your brother or your sister? Or why don't you get as good of grades as them? And we end up feeling this sense of, you're not enough, you're rejected. And I've talked to people that had fathers that just had impossible standards. Like you'd come home with 6 A's and 1 B, and they'd be like, well, why'd you get that 1 B? Like, come on, man, I got 6 A's and a B. And sometimes our fathers had the impossible standards. So we have to recognize that we've all got these needs, and the control issues, like the empowerment issues, that's my sensitive corner, right? And so maybe it's because of my own dad's passivity, just because he's like, it'll all work out. And I'm like, if I don't take care of this, nobody's going to take care of it. So I would try and take the bull by the horns. I'll control this beast. And I even saw that in me as a young kid, as I've been kind of unpacking this. So we've all got one of these areas that's super sensitive, and usually it comes because it's reflected on us because we didn't get it from those first godlike figures in our life. So you think about the words that describe the first godlike figures in your life. Maybe they were absent or distant. Maybe if you had a mom who went through postpartum right after she was born, and you don't remember that, but there's this element of moms go through real postpartum depression, and it's really hard for them. Even the most kind of emotionally steady of people, that after birth the hormones are off, and it can lead to sometimes a child feeling neglected, and the kid's not processing the neglect, but it's really, they've shown psychologically the first 5 years of a kid's life are where they figure out what's safe, what's not safe, who you connect with, who you don't connect with. Those first 5 years are really important. So if a kid doesn't feel that, you may see this sense of safety or abandonment. Maybe your first image of your parents was this passivity. That's my dad. My mom's not that way. She's the opposite. She's over frantic. But Sue's laughing because she's my mom's best friend, so she knows my mom. Maybe your parents were harsh or self-serving. It was really clear that they were not what they were supposed to be. Your dad maybe was super harsh or impossible to please. And what happens is the challenge we have is, as a kid, you don't have anything to compare your life to. That's why some of us, we don't realize how messed up our families were until we're in our 20s, and then you just find yourself mad. You're like, oh my gosh, what were they thinking, right? What kind of a parent does that? And because we don't have anything to compare it to. And so you're just like, well, that's just life. That's what life is. And then eventually you get out and live a little bit, and you go, oh, It didn't have to be that way. Robert Kiyosaki talks about how we learn things about money specifically from our parents that we just don't realize we're assimilating. There's another lady, lives right here in Corpus, brilliant lady named Ruby K. Payne. And Ruby Payne, she studied poverty. And she said basically, in everybody's lifetime, they either go up or down one socioeconomic status, right? So there's poverty, there's mid-level poverty, then there's middle class, or there's lower middle class, there's middle class. And she said, we bring mindsets from our class that we grew up, socioeconomic class, we bring that mindset into the next socioeconomic class that we go into. So you may have grown up poor, but you end up in the middle class, and the way you see money, the way you see food, like she says this, she said, in poverty, the most important thing about food is, did you get enough? Did you get enough food? Did you get enough? In the middle class, the most important thing is, how did it taste? And then in the upper class, the most important thing about food is, how was the presentation on the plate? Which is why you go to a super expensive restaurant, and you pay $70 for a plate, and there's a little piece of meat with a parsley, and they're like, oh, isn't that beautiful? You're like, I'm starving. You're like, $70 for that? But the presentation was stellar, right? So even little things like food, the way you look at money, one of the things they say in poverty is there's entertainment is a value. So what you do is you spend your money on entertainment to alleviate it. So there's a TV in every room in the house, and it's on all the time, and you've got all the cable packages, even though you really can't afford all the cable packages. And they say in middle class, it's more about attaining stuff. So that's why you see middle class neighborhoods, everybody's cars are parked on the sidewalk, or not on the sidewalk, but in the driveway, because the garage is full of stuff. And then they've got a boat over here, and then they pay somebody to store a boat for them and an RV. So you're paying all this money to accumulate all this stuff that you hardly ever use, but it's like stuff, middle class, right? And then in wealth, money is about accumulating one-of-a-kind possessions. So that's why they get the one-of-a-kind piece of art. So what happens is, if you grew up in wealth, you come with this one mindset, and then you end up maybe marrying somebody who grew up in poverty or in the middle class, and you see money, you see food, you see relationships. One of the things they talk about is how you introduce people. In poverty, one of the things you do is you quickly attack someone and belittle them to establish a pecking order. And if they can handle the belittling, you know that they're in this with you. They're like, oh, they're tough, they can handle this. In middle class, it's like, I'll never forget visiting my dad's family. They were poor. And I'll never forget, we got there and we visited them, and I hadn't seen them in like 10 years. And my aunt goes, well, how was the flight on the big plane, hotshot? And I'm like, what? What's your problem, lady? I flew up here to see you. This is my aunt. But this is the way it is in poverty. You nag and poke at somebody just to see how they'll respond, and if they're cool with it, you're like, okay, we can get along. We're in the same boat. We protect each other. Middle class, my family, we never grew up doing that. You don't insult somebody the first time you see them. In the middle class, like when you introduce someone, it's always about what they do for a living. So you're like, hey, what do you do? That's like the first question we ask anybody. Hey, I'm Joel. Oh, what do you do for a living? It's a question. In the upper class, you ask, what family are you from? Your family name. And some of us are like, I don't even understand what that means. Like, my name's Malm. That means nothing, right? But in the upper class, when you're going to the Ivy League schools, you're in the Northeast, that's how they introduce each other. Oh, this is Joel from the Malm family of shipping, or whatever, whatever. So we carry these mindsets with us because that's how we were raised, and we don't even realize we're carrying them with us because that's our framework for how we see the world. And there's so many small things. Ruby K. Payne, she has this list of like 27 ways that we see things in poverty, middle class, or upper class. And what will often happen is two people get married, somebody from the lower class, and I talked to a lady when I shared this a couple weeks ago in Houston. This girl came up to me and she was in tears. She's like, you just explained my childhood. She's like, my husband and I together make a combined income of, I think she said like $235,000. She's like, literally, we're always worried our electricity is going to be shut off. And I'm like, wait, what? She's like, when I get the money, I'll go out and spend $2,000 on a Friday and buy a bunch of clothes. And I'm like, that's like my 10-year budget for clothes, $2,000. She's like, but she's like, that was my dad. He'd get his paycheck and he'd take us all to Astroworld, which was a thing back in the day. He'd take us all to Astroworld. We'd buy the big drink. Everybody get hot dogs and sodas. And he's like, and then Monday our electricity would be shut off. But we spent thousands of dollars at Astroworld the weekend before because it was seeing money as a way to alleviate pain. So you go have fun. So my bottom line with all that, I'm going too in-depth with that, but we all carry these mindsets with us that we got from our parents. And if you're not careful, like they start influencing you and you don't even realize they're influencing you. And that's where sometimes we get into these fights with our spouse. If you're like, oh, He came from poverty, went to middle class. That's why he's obsessed with buying all these things. You maybe came from the upper class, and you're like, why is he obsessed with buying all this junk? Like, let's buy one-of-a-kind pieces that last a long time. And you're always fighting about money because you have totally different frameworks for how money works. If you're wanting to get married one day, keep this in mind. You need to read her book, Crossing the Tracks for Loves. It's a brilliant book about how this unseen thing impacts us. But I think that applies across the board in our lives. How we see everything is impacted by those first godlike figures in our life. Now, the problem with all of this is it's all tainted because we know this verse right here. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. No matter how great your parents were, they had the exact same problem you do. They have a sin problem. We all fall short of what God intended for us. And because we fall short, when we broke off that relationship with God through sin, we started looking for that security, connection, and control in other places. And the most natural place we obviously look for it as kids is you look from your parents, and they can't give it to you. So that's one of my key points here is refusing to acknowledge humanity's sin problem is foolish and dangerous. I was talking to somebody recently, and she's like, well, everyone is generally good. And I'm like, I just can't agree with that. I believe there is a capacity for good. Pastor Glenn and I were talking about that this morning. If there's a capacity for good in everyone, even apart from God, there's this moral drive within us to do good things. Like people sacrifice their lives for other people, even if they're not a Christian. You see that, right? But if you go around thinking humanity is naturally going to be doing the right thing, this is the challenge of it. We are so tainted by sin. There's a theological construct, which Pastor Glenn and I have. We can discuss this all day long, but there's a theological construct called the total depravity of man. And there's different arguments about it, what it means. But the general idea is this, and again, we could spend all day arguing about what it means, but the general idea is this. We've been tainted by sin to the point that even our best motives sometimes can turn out to be driven, or our best intentions can be driven by wrong motives. So we've just seen this recently in our country. Like, we needed to deal with this pandemic. And a bunch of people were like, well, the way to deal with it is this way. Let's control everybody and tell them what to do and force them to do these certain things. Now, you can't tell me there wasn't some sort of power trip behind that. Like, you can argue they had the best intentions in mind. Okay, but at some point it turned into, hey, we've got the control here. They may have started out with good intentions, but we've all got this thing with us that wants power, control, that wants a sense of connection, that wants a sense of approval, that wants a sense of security. And so in the name of getting those things, oftentimes people will do very dark things and think they're doing the right thing. Hitler thought he was doing the right thing. Every man's way seems right to him in his own eyes. Hitler's like, if we can just get rid of the scourge of these Jews, everything will be good. In his mind, it literally was the right thing to do. But we see it was totally wrong. So there's this element within us that if we refuse to acknowledge that we have a tremendous capacity for wrong, to do bad things, you can very quickly become self-righteous and think, I'm doing this for the good of humanity, and really do some diabolical things for the good of humanity. So there's this important element that we have to recognize that, G.K. Chesterton, he wrote an article, somebody asked him one time, he said, what's wrong with the world? And he wrote an article, and the article just said, I am. You have to recognize you are what's wrong with the world, and we are all responsible for taking on, dealing with this fact that we have a dark sense within us. Now, we see that, and this is, again, theological construct that we could argue about. We see that sin entered the world through Adam. There's a verse in Romans that says this. Actually, this one's in Hebrews, I believe. No, this is Romans. It says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. And you're like, what is he talking about? Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, which we talked about a minute ago, who was a type of the one who was to come. So basically he's saying, we've all got this sin problem. Adam started it. Some would say Eve started it, but I have an argument, because I hate passivity, that it was actually Adam that started it because he was passive and just took the fruit. I think it's Adam's problem, yeah. And all the women said, yeah, what's wrong with that man, right? I hate passivity. Why? Anyway. 4, if because one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. So he's basically saying this whole lineage of ours had this sin problem. We all willingly participated in this sin problem. And it says, but therefore as one trespass led to condemnation for all men, when Adam was passive and took the fruit and sinned, broke the relationship with God, it says there's one act of righteousness that leads to justification and life for all men. For as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. And of course, he's referring to the fact that we all came from this broken lineage of sin. Like our parents had sin problems, as good as they were, they had problems, they had sin problems, right? And as much as that is, Jesus came, and part of the reason Jesus had to become fully God and fully man, I believe, was so that he could redeem the family lineage. Like, why is it so important that Jesus was fully God, fully man? Well, because he was the only way to breach the gap between the two. And so by him becoming fully man, he was actually able to redeem our entire family line, which is a big concept. You're like, wait, what? But he made it possible. He changed the structure, and this is where he was talking about, Paul was talking about earlier, that until the law came through Moses, the only way to get salvation was through obedience to the law and through these sacrifices. Jesus became the sacrifice, restored the relationships, and now we have the capacity to walk in a restored relationship. And that's where it says, if anyone's in Christ, he's a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. A few years ago, I was in Israel, and I was visiting a friend of mine who works for the U.S. Embassy there, and he offered to let me use his car. And I was like, okay. And I was like, so what if I get pulled over? And he's like, you won't get pulled over. I'm like, I won't get pulled over? And he's like, nope. Your license plate indicates that you're a U.S. citizen driving a U.S. Embassy car. They won't pull you over. And I'm like, really? I can do anything? He's like, well, don't do anything. But he's like, they're not going to pull you over because when you're in that car, you are in the United States and you are a representative of the ambassador of the United States on U.S. territory. He's like, they will not mess with you. And he's like, but that means you just don't go around doing stupid stuff in my car. He's like, you got to behave well and drive and follow the rules. And this is a picture of what Paul is saying we are now. He's like, Jesus came and he like reconciled God and man. And he's like, now you're living by this higher standard and you're an ambassador to those around you saying, be reconciled to God. Like, hey, I'm going to live right so I can show you what living right does. Living in God's order is a blessing to you. And when you live in God's order, let me show you what that looks like. And it's like driving around in an ambassador's car. Like, you're in the world, but you're not of it, and you're like you're an example everywhere you go. And that's what he's saying. Our job now, because of reconciliation through Christ, if anyone's in Christ, they're a new creation. He says your job now is to become the person that says, be reconciled to God. So there's this ancient theme throughout literature, and you see it in a lot of our modern movies, that at some point, every hero has to go and rescue their father. That's a big concept, but if you think about Pinocchio, before he could become a real boy, he had to go save Geppetto from the belly of the whale. If you think about Luke Skywalker, right? Luke Skywalker, he goes off and finds that Darth Vader, which actually means dark father in German, right, is his father. And then he's like, I know there's still good in him. And he goes, and after the third movie, he actually rescues Darth Vader from the dark side. And then Luke achieves his destiny, bringing unity to the Force or whatever. There's this ancient concept. You see it now, Jyn Erso in the most recent Star Wars movie. She has to go find her father and redeem his name. She's like, he wasn't as bad as everyone thought he was. He was working on this Death Star, but he created this, this deep flaw in there that if we can attack it. And so she ends up being the hero that rescues her father from kind of having his name soiled, right? Tainted, yeah. And there's something here, right? If you look at Jesus, he came and rescued our entire lineage from sin. Now, we can't do that. Only Jesus can. But remember, we now are the carriers of the message that we are reconciled to God. And so there's this deep sense that all of us have a responsibility to carry on this work. And there's this weird verse. It says in in Hebrews 11. If you read Hebrews 11, it's called the heroes of the faith, the hall of faith. It's all these people that say, by faith, Noah did this. By faith, Abraham did this. By faith, all these people did all of these amazing things. And then he says this, he wraps it up with this strange kind of esoteric, mysterious line. He says this, these were all commended for their faith. All these people I mentioned, yet none of them received what had been promised. And this is where this weird line comes in. He says, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. You go, what in the world is he talking about? Like, only together with us would they be made perfect? Like, how can we make anyone perfect? And I think that this idea that when we choose to participate, Pastor Glenn said it this way earlier this morning, when we choose to participate in the righteousness that it is offered to us through Jesus Christ, we have the capacity to change the course of our family's history. You may have started bad. You may have started from a place of being set back. You may have started with a flawed parents who gave you a bad example of what God is. But when we choose to accept the free gift of Christ, we literally become participants, ambassadors in changing the world and literally bringing Christ's dominion to the world. And that's what I believe this being made perfect is talking about, that through us, they may not have been all they could be, but we can take it even further than they took it. And that's what I want to look at, 4 ways that we can take it even further than our parents took it. And I think the first step to doing that is that we have to choose to cover our parents' shame. You know, when sin entered the world, the first thing we felt was shame. We realized we were naked. And there's this weird story of Noah. You know, Noah saves the earth, like saves his family, builds this ark. There's a story of Noah, and it says Noah began to be a man of the soil. This is after Noah has saved his family. They set up shop. They're starting a new world. And he says, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and became drunk, and he laid uncovered in his tent. So Noah had a little bit too much to drink, passed out naked in his tent. And it says, and Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. So you get this picture. Ham walks in. He's like, my drunk dad, right? And he's like, goes and tells his brother, look at our stupid drunk dad. And the brother's like, no, we're not going to do that. So they take a cover and they walk in backwards to cover their father's shame when he's in his weakest moment of sin. Well, Noah wakes up and he's ticked, right? So it says their faces were turned backward and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. And then he goes on ranting for paragraph after paragraph about how cursed Canaan's going to be for not covering his dad when his dad was naked. Now, what I think this says is that there's this element of blessing that comes to us when we recognize there's flaws in our family line. Some of us don't even want to recognize it. But there's this element of blessing that comes when we recognize that our family lineage is flawed, but choose, knowing the full truth of how flawed they are, to instead cover the shame. Now, that doesn't mean we ignore it, but it means we cover it. And there's so many stories in the Bible of people, for example, Jacob and Esau. Jacob ends up getting the blessing from his father because he covers himself with this fur. It's an image of the sacrifice Jesus became. And he ends up getting this blessing from his father. And when the father, who's blind, essentially, feels him, he goes, oh, you're your brother. And he's like, yeah, I'm my brother, right? And there's this idea that we get in only by getting covered by this mantle of grace. And it's a big concept, and I think that's what's saying here. Like, we at some point have to cover over with grace what our parents did, what our parents weren't. But the first key is recognizing that we come from a flawed line. And that's a hard thing to do for a lot of us. I'll never forget when I was about 7 years old, my dad, my mom, our whole family was on a road trip through the south part of the U.S., and my dad said, hey, we're going to stop and see Grandpa here in Alabama. And I was like, Grandpa? My grandpa lives in Illinois. He's like, well, actually, I got to tell you something about your family. I was adopted because your real grandfather was a raging alcoholic. Dad told me that his first memory of his dad was of his real dad was him walking around with a shotgun. His mom hid him in a shed, locked him in the shed to protect him from his crazy drunken dad. And my dad's first memory is seeing him through the cracks in the shed yelling, Ricky, where are you? I'm going to kill you. And then the police came and arrested his dad. this was the man we were going to visit. So we actually met him at a police station because Dad's like, I'm not so sure he's changed. But the guy said he had found Christ. The guy said, I found Christ, and I'm a changed man. And Dad's like, okay, well, that's cool. Let's meet at a police station. Just make sure. So, but I remember thinking, wait a second. The guy that was my grandpa wasn't really my grandpa? And he's like, no, that's the man who adopted me, who ended up marrying my mother. And I'm like, I just remember thinking, wait, my family's not perfect? And that was my first realization. It was an early age. And all of us have that moment where we kind of go, you see your uncle and you're like, oh, wow, that guy's in my family? He's really whacked, right? We all have a moment where we see somebody in our family and we see their drunken, naked state. Maybe it's actually drunkenness. Maybe it's actual nakedness. Who knows? But that embarrassing moment where you're like, oh, it's my family. And I've talked to people that had to go bring their dad out of a bar at 16. Their mom would be like, go get your dad. And you bring your dad home from the bar. He's drunk and passed out. And then he comes and beats them after you brought him home. I've heard horror stories of this. But at some point, we all have to recognize we've got flaws, and so did our family. But then there's this blessing that comes when you choose not to ignore the fact that the flaws were there, but I'm going to cover the shame. And then once we cover that shame, I think we have to take on the identity of Christ and we have to walk in forgiveness. Forgiveness is where it's at. Because until you choose to forgive what your parents weren't, you're never going to be able to move forward. And this is a danger that we live in our world right now, is we have a lot of people, here's my key point. A woke world, can you pop that next slide up? Yeah. Cancel culture and wokeness, they offer no forgiveness. And so a lot of people deeply know there's something wrong with this cancel culture, but just last summer, the director, okay, this is crazy. The director of the starting ceremony for the Olympics, was it in Korea or whatever? He got fired because he admitted that when he was 10 or 11, he bullied a kid in high school, or in middle school. He got fired for that. That's a world of no forgiveness, y'all. A guy who's doing nothing right now but good, creating this opening ceremony for the Olympics, he got fired because he admitted to bullying someone. That's a world of no forgiveness that we do not want to live in, where everything you've ever done is paraded out. And the funny thing is the people who parade it out are just as screwed up as the people who did the thing, but they don't want to look at their own depravity. And so you become self-righteous. Well, I'm a good person. I'm weeding out bullying. And he bullied somebody 30 years ago. There's probably some kid who's got hurt feelings still. Now that he's 45 years old, some kid who's got hurt feelings because of your bullying. You have no business doing that. But you don't want to look at the log in your own eye. You just want to go after the speck in your neighbor's. And that is the danger we live in this world right now. And a lot of people are running around burning down buildings, burning down entire cities, because I think that they've got some unresolved daddy issues. And they look at their father as the oppressor, and they say, and you go, well, why are you burning down things? Why are you burning down the world? Well, I'm just mad. Well, what about? Everyone, everything, everyone's corrupt, but me. They don't actually say that, but that's what they're thinking. And a lot of it's because of unresolved choosing to not forgive, and forgiveness really is a choice. I'm not going to go into it, the whole depth of it, but forgiveness is a choice. It's not something you have to wait around for somebody to apologize. Forgiveness is on you. Jesus talks about that, where he says, he does so many parables, and he basically says, and this is one of these uncomfortable things Jesus said that you don't put on a Hallmark card. He said, if you don't forgive those who have harmed you, your Heavenly Father's not going to forgive you. And you're like, wait, whoa, that messes with my theology. I don't know. It's in there. I don't know what to do with it. But basically he's saying it's really important that you forgive because it's eating away at you if you don't. And you say, would he unforgive my sins? Man, I don't know. That's like way beyond my pay grade theologically, but it's in there. And you got to deal with that fact. So basically, I think he's saying it's imperative. You forgive those who did the things against you. And the people who often did the worst things against us are the people that we trusted the most to give us what we needed in the area of security, connection, or control. And even the best parents, like my dad and mom, outstanding parents, they had their flaws, right? So at some point, it was in my mid-20s, I realized some of the things that my mom had said to me had impacted me in a negative way, and I went and approached her, and she was so devastated. She's like, oh no, I've screwed up my kid. I'm like, no, you didn't screw me up. I'm just saying, you did a great job. This affected me, but we came to an agreement. It grew our relationship closer. And a lot of times we have to just acknowledge that, but choose to cover their shame, and we have to forgive them. That's another thing that where Jesus, he does this, the prayer of the Lord's Prayer. He says, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. He says, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. And then it says this, next slide. Is it my thing or is it just locked up? Oh, okay. For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. And this is where he says something really uncomfortable. But if you don't forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. And I think it's really interesting that if, we usually say, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. But this is actually what follows in most of the translations of the Bible. Some leave this out, but this is actually in there because that's a very uncomfortable truth. So we have to choose to forgive. And forgiveness your parents, whoever hurt you, may never acknowledge their guilt, but you don't have to wait around for them to acknowledge their guilt. Jesus, while he was on the cross, looking at the people who had betrayed him, said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. He set the example for forgiveness for us. So we've got to choose to forgive. And once you choose to forgive, it sets you on the course, I believe, to be able to do one of the 10 commandments, which is this: honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And the real danger about talking about this stuff, a lot of times you're like, well, why are we digging up past stuff? It's just going to make people mad. The thing is, it's laying there anyway. There's a story in the book of 1 Kings, I believe, with Josiah. And King Josiah, all of a sudden, he realizes how far Israel has gotten off track. And so what he does is he goes and he tracks back. And Josiah had a whacked out family. Like, if you read his family lineage, his grandpa, it says, did more evil in the sight of the Lord than any king that came before him. And then right after that, his father, it says, and then his father did more evil than anyone who had come before him. It's like, whoa, bad family lineage. Well, Josiah realizes how far his family has gotten off track. And he does this crazy thing, and he goes and he digs up these bones of the prophets that had led Israel astray, and he takes all the bones and burns them. I'm like, wow, that is animosity right there. But I think that's symbolic of what we have to do sometimes is you want to be set free, and it's easier to just say, let's just ignore it, put it in the closet. But sometimes you have to pull out the bones and acknowledge them. And the goal isn't to just come up with a bunch of grievances against your parents. The goal is to recognize the imprint of what their sin left on you and break free from that, because that's what we want to do. We want to break the cycle to set our family free from these family lineage choices that they made. And I think honor simply means respect, right? And respect, we live in a culture where it's like, well, nobody's going to get my respect until they earn it. That's not necessarily a godly thing. That's from a very egalitarian society, but that's not necessarily. There are certain people, the Bible says, that deserve your respect just because they're in a position of authority. Now, that doesn't mean you can't question them. But it says you've got to respect those that God has put in position and leadership over you. Now again, that doesn't mean you can't push back against them, but respect means I'm honoring you because of the position you're in, and just because you're in that position, I'm giving honor to whom honor is due. And that makes me very uncomfortable because I'm of the mindset that you don't get respect from me until you've shown yourself worthy of respect. And that was one of the mistakes I made as a young man. I had no respect for anyone in any position. I was like, I don't care who you are. You're the same as me. And I that was a big flaw of mine, probably because my dad was passive. It's his fault. But I'm just kidding. But I realized this. There was this thing I saw online that said this. It said, if you're trying to figure out why to respect the people that came before you rather than burn down their statues, in order to be born, you needed 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 second great-grandparents, 32 third great-grandparents. Interesting, a family member of mine did a lineage tracking of our family, and we actually found out that one of my family members was an indentured slave in Louisiana. She was a French girl. She was, she wasn't African-American, she was a white girl, and she was an indentured slave, and my third great-grandpa bought her out of slavery and then went and married her. I thought that was interesting. Okay. Yeah, crazy, right? I was like, what? He bought her out of slavery and married her. I'm like, that'll preach. But 64 fourth great-grandparents, 128 fifth great-grandparents, 250, anyways, the line goes on. The bottom line is this. For you to be born today from 12 previous generations, you needed a total sum of 4,094 ancestors over the last 400 years. Now, think about that for a second. Here's what to think about. How many struggles did those people go through? Like, we got it really easy right now, right? You drove to church, I'm guessing, today. Can you imagine what it's like riding on a horse to church or walking 5, 6, 7 miles to church, uphill in the snow both ways? How many wars did they go through? 400 years ago was not that long ago. That was pre-America. So you're talking about some of them, like some of my relatives, they were French, went through the French Revolution, a very violent, bloody thing. How many difficulties, how much sadness, how much happiness, how many love stories, how many expressions of hope for the future that were shattered did your ancestors have to undergo for you to exist in this present moment? You think, wow, I've got it pretty good compared to what most people that have come before me had it. And that's one of the dangers we have when things are really good. You forget what it's like to not have it really good. The curse of knowledge must be constantly compensated for. When you know something, it's hard to remember what it's like to not know it. And so I think that's a really important thing, that when it comes to respect, you need to have a little bit of humility. And in fact, King Solomon says this. He says, before destruction, a man's heart is haughty, proud, but humility comes before honor. Before you can honor somebody for the position they're in, just because they're in the position they're in, regardless of whether they earned your respect or not, you have to have a bit of humility, recognizing who you are, where you came from. And when you come and approach somebody from a place of humility, it goes a lot better. My grandpa, the one who was my adopted grandfather, the guy I always called my grandpa, who wasn't really my dad's father, I never had a really good view of him. My mom's grandfather was always buying. He was very aggressive like me, right? He was always buying property and selling it and making profits, and he was just always making money. My other grandpa, he worked at a junkyard his whole life. The guy that raised my dad worked at a junkyard his entire life. And I never really had a lot of respect for him. I was like, what a bum. The guy's always smoking a cigar. My dad told me one time the guy behind him, the guy that owned the gas station behind my dad's family where they grew up, he offered to literally like almost give the gas station to my grandpa and help him make a success out of it. My grandpa got afraid and he's like, no, I can't take the risk. So my dad's like, so we grew up in poverty even though we had this chance to really have broken free and own his own business, but my dad was afraid. So I always had that in my mind that my grandpa was a coward. Well, my grandpa died a few years ago, and we went to his funeral. And I discovered my grandpa got a silver star in World War II. And I looked him up, and I found this online. Douglas D. Malm, the President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, July 9th, 1918, and under the provision of the Army Regulations. I'm going to skip it. It says, award to Private First Class Douglas D. Malm, Medical Department, United States Army, for gallantry. That is not a word I associated with my grandpa. In action against the enemy while serving with the medical detachment, 90th Infantry Division in France on 22nd July, 1944. The bravery and self-sacrifice displayed by Private First Class Malm's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. He won the second highest award for bravery that there is. But I never saw him that way because he never talked about it. And I thought, why didn't he talk about this? Like, that's a bragging right. But I just wonder, what did he see over there? What violence did he see that he's like, I don't ever want to talk about that again. I don't want my kids to have to live there. I fought so my kids don't have to face that. This is a guy that I just saw as a bum who smoked a cigar and worked at a junkyard the rest of his life. But in his 20s, the man was a hero. And the government of the United States recognized it with a silver star, which is huge. And I thought, man, I'm such a moron. I didn't even honor him. I never saw him as something amazing. But you think, like, what did he go through that he just never wanted to talk about it again, which I get. Losing family members, or losing friends. He got wounded himself, I think. And you see all these things, and you're like, why? It's no wonder that for the rest of his life, he just wanted to chill, smoke cigars, and work in a junkyard where nobody's shooting at him. But I wonder in our family lineage how much of that exists that we don't even know about. Heroism we don't even know about. Sacrifices we don't know about. And we throw great dishonor on those who came before us when we find one little speck in their eye and we go after that and say, well, they were this or they were that. And so we're going to tear down that statue because, they were a product of their generation, right? Yeah, but what else did they do to set the stage for where you're at today? And show a little bit of humility, man. Honor them, respect them. Does that make sense? Yeah, you want to take a quick break? That's a great segue point right into my next point. All right, 5-minute break and then come back. We'll keep going.